27 The interval and the supplement. The themes of the first 11 chapters are the genesis and degeneration of language, the relationships between speech and writing, the difference between the formation of the languages of the North and the languages of the South. Why is it necessary to treat these problems before proposing a theory of music? For several types of reasons. 1. There is no music before language. And music is born of voice and not of sound. No prelinguistic sonority can, according to Rousseau, open the time of music. In the beginning is the song. This proposition is absolutely necessary within Rousseau's systematics. If music awakens in song, if it is initially uttered, vociferated, it is because, like all speech, it is born in passion. That is to say, in the transgression of need by desire and the awakening of pity by imagination. Everything proceeds from this inaugural distinction. It seems then that need dictated the first gestures, while the passions wrung forth the first words. If music presupposes voice, it comes into being at the same time as human society. As speech, it requires that the other be present to me as other through compassion. Animals, whose pity is not awakened by the imagination, have no affinity with the other as such. That is why there is no animal music. One speaks of animal music only by looseness of vocabulary and by anthropomorphic projection. The difference between the glands and the voice is the difference between animality and humanity. Transgressing space, mastering the outside, placing souls in communication, voice transcends natural animality. That is to say, a certain death signified by space. Exteriority is inanimate. The arts of space carry death within themselves, and animality remains the inanimate face of life. The song presents life to itself. In that sense, it is more natural to man but more foreign to a nature which is in itself dead, and nature still one effigy. One sees here what difference at the same time interior and exterior divides the significations of nature, life, animality, humanity, art, speech, and song. The animal who, as we have seen, has no relationship to death, is on the side of death. Speech, on the other hand, is living speech even while it institutes a relation to death, and so on. It is presence in general that is thus divided. From this it is evident that painting is closer to nature and that music is more dependent on human art. It is evident also that the one is more interesting than the other precisely because it does more to relate man to man, and gives us some idea of our kind. Painting is often dead and inanimate. It can carry you to the depth of the desert, but as soon as vocal signs strike your ear, they announce to you a being like yourself. They are, so to speak, the organs of the Sioux one. If they also paint solitude for you SILS vous paintent aussi la solitude, they tell you are not there alone. Birds whistle, man alone sings. And one cannot hear either singing or a symphony without immediately acknowledging the presence of another intelligent being. Chap 16, pages 63-64j. Song is at the orient of music, but it does not reduce itself to voice any more than voice reduces itself to noise. In the Dictionary of Music, Rousseau confesses his embarrassment in the article song chant, tune in the contemporary English translation J. If the song is indeed a kind of modification of the human voice, it is difficult to assign to it an absolutely characteristic proper J modality. After having proposed the calculations J of intervals, Rousseau advances the most equivocal criterion of permanence, and then of melody as imitation of the accents of the speaking or passionate voice. The difficulty is that the concepts of an intrinsic and systematic description must be found. No more than the voice 34 does the song disclose its essence in an anatomical description. But vocal intervals are also alien to the system of musical intervals. Rousseau therefore hesitates, in the dictionary as much as in the essay, between two necessities, of marking the difference between the systems of vocal and musical intervals, but also of reserving in the resources of song in the original voice. The notion of imitation reconciles these two exigencies within ambiguity. The first chapter of the essay corresponds in part to this passage in the article song. It is very difficult to determine in what the voice which forms the words, differs from that which forms the song. This difference is sensible, but we cannot very clearly perceive in what it consists, and when we seek to find it, we find it not. Mons. Dodart has made anatomic observations, by favor of which he thinks really to discover, in the different situations of the larynx, the cause of two kinds of voice. But I do not know if these observations or the consequences drawn from them, are to be depended on. There seems to be wanting to the sounds which form the discourse, no more than permanence, to form a real song. It appears also, that the different inflections which we give to the voice in speaking, form intervals which are not at all harmonic, which form no parts of the system in our music, and which consequently not being expressed in notes, are not properly a song for us. The song does not seem natural to mankind. Though the savages of America sing, because they speak, yet a true savage never sung. The dumb don't sing, they form only accents without permanence, a disgustful soward's muted bellowing which their wants draw from them. I should doubt, if the Sierper, with all his ingenuity, could ever draw from them any musical air. Children scream, cry, but they don't sing. The first expressions of nature have nothing in them melodious or sonorous, and they children, learn to sing, as to speak, from our example. The melodious and appreciable tune, is only an artificial imitation of the accents in the speaking or passionate voice. We cry, we complain, without singing, but, in song, we imitate cries and laments, and as, of all imitations, the most interesting is that of the human passions, so of all the methods of imitating, the most agreeable is the song. Only the word song chant is italicized by Rousseau. Through that example one may analyze the subtle functioning of the notions of nature and imitation. On several levels, nature is the ground, the inferior step, it must be crossed, exceeded, but also rejoined. We must return to it, but without annulling the difference. This difference, separating the imitation from what it imitates, must be almost nil. Through the voice one must transgress the nature that is animal, savage, mute, infant or crying, by singing transgress or modify the voice. But the song must imitate cries and laments. This leads to a second polar determination of nature, it becomes the unity as ideal limit of the imitation and what is imitated, of voice and song. If that unity were accomplished, imitation would become useless, the unity of unity and difference would be lived in immediacy. Such, according to Rousseau, is the archaeoteleologic definition of nature. Elsewhere is the name and the place, the name of the non-place of that nature. Elsewhere in time, in illo tempore, elsewhere in space, alibi. The natural unity of the cry, the voice, and the song, is the Proto-Greek or the Chinese experience. The article voice analyses and amplifies the same debate around the theses of Dodart and of Duclos, in the article Declamation d'anciens in the Encyclopedia. The differences among languages are measured by the distance which, in the system of each language, separates the voice of speech from the voice of song, for as there are languages more or less harmonious, whose accents are more or less musical, we take notice also, in these languages, that the speaking and singing voices are connected or removed in the same proportion. So, as the Italian language is more musical than the French, its speaking is less distant from song, and in that language it is easier to recognize a man singing if we have heard him speak. In a language which would be completely harmonious, as was the Greek at the beginning, the difference between the speaking and singing voices would be nil. We should have the same voice for speaking and singing. Perhaps that may be at present the case of the Chinese. 2. We have just accepted two pieces of evidence. The unity of nature or the identity of origin is shaped and undermined by a strange difference which constitutes it by breaching it. We must account for the origin of the voice of speech, therefore of society, before assigning, and in order to assign, its possibility to music, that is to say to the voice of song. But since in the beginning of the all-harmonious voice, word, and song were, identified, before and in order to have perhaps a juridical or methodological meaning, they have no structural or genetic value. One might have been tempted to accord a structural value to the difference between speech and song, since Rousseau recognized that the latter comes to modify the former. But the archaeoteleological concept of nature also annuls the structural point of view. In the beginning or in the ideal of the all-harmonious voice, the modification becomes one with the substance that it modifies. This scheme has a general value and governs all discourses, from the moment that they make the smallest appeal to any of these notions, no matter which one, nature and its other, archaeology and eschatology, substance and mode, origin and genesis. Of course, the methodological or juridical point of view has no rigorous value the moment the difference of value between the structural and genetic points of view is annulled. Rousseau does not notice this consequence, but we should recognize that it would wreak havoc to more than one discourse. We must now study the consequence. It is a matter of presenting, with reference to the origin of language and society, a certain number of oppositions of concepts indispensable for understanding at the same time the possibility of both speech and song. And above all for understanding the tension or the difference that, in language as in music, operates at once as opening and menace, principle of life and of death. Since the first speech must be good, since the archaeoteleology of the nature of the language and the language of nature dictate to us, as does the voice of nature, that the original and ideal essence of speech is song itself, one cannot treat the two origins separately. But as the method of the discourse must retrace its path and take into account a historical regression or degradation, it must separate the two questions provisionally and, in a certain manner, begin with the end. This then is the story. For the history that follows the origin and is added to it is nothing but the story of the separation between song and speech. If we consider the difference which fractured the origin, it must be said that this history, which is decadence and degeneracy through and through, had no prehistory. Degeneration as separation, severing of voice and song, has already begun. We shall see that Rousseau's entire text describes origin as the beginning of the end, as the inaugural decadence. Yet, in spite of that description, the text twists about in a sort of oblique effort to act as if degeneration were not prescribed in the Genesis and as if evil supervenate upon a good origin. As if song and speech, which have the same act and the same birth pangs, had not already begun to separate themselves. Here one re-encounters the advantages and dangers of the concept of the supplement, and also of the concept of fatal advantage and dangerous supplement. The growth of music, the desolating separation of song and speech, has the form of writing as dangerous supplement, calculation and grammatically, loss of energy and substitution. The history of music is parallel to the history of the language, its evil is in essence graphic. When he undertakes to explain how music has degenerated, chapter 19, Rousseau recalls the unhappy history of the language and of its disastrous perfecting, to the degree that the language improved, melody, being governed by new rules, imperceptibly lost its former energy, and the calculus of intervals was substituted for nicety of inflection, italics added, post 68. Substitution distances from birth, from the natural or maternal origin. Forgetfulness of the beginning is a calculation that puts harmony in the place of melody, the science of intervals in the place of the warmth of accent. In this weaning of the voice of speech, a new object comes at once to usurp and compensate for the maternal traits. What he suffers then from this is the oral accent. Music thus finds itself deprived of its proper, that is to say natural and moral, effects, melody being forgotten, and the attention of musicians being completely turned toward harmony. Everything gradually came to be governed according to this new object. The genres, the modes, the scale, all received new faces. Harmonic successions came to dictate the sequence of parts. This sequence having usurped the name of melody, it was, in effect, impossible to recognize the traits of its mother in this new melody. And our musical system having thus gradually become purely harmonic, it is not surprising that its oral tone accent has suffered, and that our music has lost almost all its energy. Thus we see how singing gradually became an art entirely separate from speech, from which it takes its origin, how the harmonics of sounds resulted in the forgetting of vocal inflections, and finally, how music, restricted to purely physical concurrences of vibrations, found itself deprived of the moral power it had yielded when it was the twofold voice of nature, italics added, post 71. The points italicized in the passage should guide a sub-reading of this text and of many analogous texts. On each occasion one would notice, 1. That Rousseau weaves his text with heterogeneous threads, the instantaneous displacement that substitutes a new object, which institutes a substitutive supplement, must constitute a history, a progressive becoming gradually producing the forgetting of the voice of nature. The violent and eruptive movement that usurps, separates and deprives is simultaneously described as a progressive implicating of, and a gradual distancing from, the origin, a slow growth of a disease of language. Weaving together the two significations of supplementarity substitution and accretion, Rousseau describes the replacement of an object as a deficit in energy, the production of a replacement as effacement by forgetting. 2. The adverb doubly twofold summons up in its own condition of possibility the metaphor of the voice of nature, gentle voice, maternal voice, song as original voice, sung speech conforms to the prescriptions of natural law. In every sense of this word, nature speaks. And to hear and understand the laws formed by her gentle voice which, as we recall, no one is tempted to disobey, but which one must have been tempted to disobey, it is necessary to find again the oral accent of sung speech, take possession again of our own lost voice, the voice which, uttering and hearing, understanding itself signifying a melodious law, was the twofold voice of nature.